So we'll get right into it. For those of you who haven't met me yet, I'm Faye. I am the new biostatistician for the Department of Medicine. My office is located on the 5th floor. I still don't remember my office number, but I'll get a handle on that. If you just come to the 5th floor, if you're looking for me, you will find me. I'm in one of those cubes. So I went over last presentation on how to calculate power and sample size. If you weren't at that meeting, I think we'll be sending out some of the presentation because that was the first one, so we didn't actually have it recorded. But today's is kind of like an extension of that because it does speak to what you need to have in terms of your manuscript to make it have quality to it and possibly get it accepted to a journal. So I would definitely say the most common question I get is people want to know why the manuscript was rejected by a journal, and I do conduct reviews for a few journals, although I can tell you the reason is never clear. So, when we review and, edit people's journals to get them, people's papers to get them approved for the journal, usually you're assigned only a section of it. And we do spend less time writing out all the reasons we don't want it to be published. So, you might get some feedback right away about, why they want you to refine this further for next time, but usually it is not evident why it was rejected. But these are some of the very basic reasons. For example, when I review manuscripts, one of the main things I look for is if your sample is good enough for the differences you're looking to measure. The other thing is sometimes people have a poor analysis plan, and that's just because they're analyzing everything by themselves. They're writing the paper, they're doing the analysis, they're doing things that are outside of the expertise. And so you see that throughout this presentation, I refer to the fact that you should consult with a biostatistician, and this will really make your manuscript really strong. And also in terms of the methodology, this is another thing that a biostatistician can help you with because you probably know the basics of how the data was collected. But in terms of choosing the statistical test and making sure that you write it in a way that if a reviewer like myself who has a stats background reads it, it's understandable. So you have to make sure that those two pieces connect because you can write the methodology, but it's in an appealing manner to write it for a reviewer because the statistics are always reviewed by individuals in statistics. So a statistician should write it for the statistician to read it. Also not having your hypotheses clear in the beginning could really create some poor concepts. Usually when I work with individuals, I'm telling them to refine the idea to be very, very specific. Because I know as researchers, we all have a lot of ideas, but sometimes putting too much into one manuscript can get it rejected. And then also inaccurate conclusions. For this, it's actually really important, but most people don't know that, concluding and being super confident in the result that you found is actually a limitation because it is research after all. Like even what you find, there are some loopholes that you're never gonna know if it was true or not. So we always want to be humble in concluding and saying there were a lot of other things we didn't know that we hope to do in our next study. And then I put these other ones that are usually like the journal guidelines that have been violated. For example, it might not be appropriate for the journal. Let's say you're writing a paper on dysphagia in elderly patients and you want to put it in a journal meant for pediatrics. It might not be appropriate for them to accept that journal because they primarily focus on children, and this one will be for like a geriatric patient. The impact is low. When you start to think about a study and an idea that you want to conceptualize, one of the things to think about is how often has this been done? Because there could be exactly the same paper out there in the same journal with all the same exposures and outcome you're looking at. So what you want to do is you want to set yourself apart, add something new that makes the journal want to accept you. And of course, if you don't talk about your IRB and it had to deal with patients and all these other things that have ethical considerations, it will be rejected. And then violation of journal ethics, this one is a little bit harder to know, but usually it's specific to the journal you want to publish it, and you have to review what rules they have, and all of them are different and all of them are weird. You will read those rules and you say like, why? Why do they want me to stick to 3 pages? Like, what can I put in there? But you know, if you go to 5 pages, you violated the rules that they have set, so they will reject your paper. Okay, so again, when people ask me how they know if their paper was rejected, sometimes you know based on the feedback you receive, sometimes you really don't know anything. But what I want to do is empower you to consult a biostatistician so you can make your paper stronger. Like, that's the only way that it's going to happen, is to move on forward and make sure that when you do submit a manuscript that it has a stronger basis than the last one that was rejected. But here's just a little kind of takeaway, is that a rejection is actually better than a retraction. And I say that because if you get a rejection, you get feedback with it. We tell you what's wrong with the paper or what's wrong with you know, your methods and your conclusions, and then you can refine it next time and resubmit. A retraction, however, is something that's been accepted, and usually this is specific to your findings, and then you get critiqued on how this was performed, especially if you can't be reproduced. You know, if I've seen a lot of these in the journal that I review for, it's usually the individual retracting after they've been asked a specific question that they don't know the answer to or they never considered, but made conclusions on. So if that's why I say you have to be lenient when you make conclusions. Don't say because we found this, that means it causes that. You know, someone might call you out and say, can you prove how this causes it? And then you're struggling with the idea, and once one individual finds you and critiques that same you know, idea, you will get multiple emails and questions about it, because everyone wants to be able to replicate your research, and if they can't, it's really in a journal that people want to use, but they can't, which leads to that retraction. You know, and then this can impact your submissions to other journals because now it's on your record. If you have like a PubMed or NCBI profile, now you have a retraction on there. So when you submit, they will ask you if you've ever had a retraction. It might not accept you solely based on that. You know, and then it can ruin your reputation based on how many retractions you've had. And I've seen some of those, like individuals they publish, and they have like 10 retractions, and then no other journal will ever accept you. So you want to make sure that when you put a paper out there, it's really quality and best to your knowledge, and in your conclusions, you want to make sure you highlight all your limitations so that when an individual critiques your paper, you can say, we did mention this as a limitation in our paper, which means we're not solely confident that our findings were, you know, true to the effect that we were looking at. So I put this in there because this was a recent one that was retracted, and it's just, you know, someone concluding on this dilation they had found, and they received an email, well, the editor received an email saying that their methodology could not be reproduced, and was asking, it was specifically based on producing an estimate with standard errors instead of standard deviations. And so they were asked to reproduce these methodology with standard errors, and they could not do it. So it ended up being retracted because, I don't know, they couldn't say why they couldn't reproduce it. And so if you can't tell the editor that, it means that either data was falsified, someone conducted something wrong, results are untrue. So that will lead to a retraction. So I put step 0 here before you conceptualize your idea and start working on it. Consult a biostatistician, say, is this doable? Does this make sense? Can we refine this further? Always having another individual look at it can definitely add to that quality. And then step 1 here, I put read. Because the idea that I mentioned is if you're putting a manuscript out there, you want to know if there's a similar topic with that exposure or outcome. Right? You want to first look at what the impact of your manuscript will be if you do publish it. And you want to have a high impact, not just, I want to publish because I just want to put a paper out there. Because that's actually one of the most common reasons when editors read a paper, we get easily bored because we've seen that there's a couple of hundreds of those things. It doesn't make for an interesting case to say, okay, this individual's paper needs to be accepted because they've demonstrated such a novel study that needs to be out there for people to see that it works and for people to adopt it and reproduce. So you want to really read on the topic. And if you have an idea, let's say this has been your dream to do this research, obviously you don't have to abandon it. But making a novel can mean adding a few other things. If you had one exposure, you could make it 5 other exposures. You could do something that's different than what you had seen in the literature in terms of the methods they use. Maybe you adopt a different method, but do not reproduce the exact same papers that are already out there. And then choosing appropriate journals, like starting small. And I always say this because when people start to publish papers, they want to just put it in one of those really, high-rated journals. I know one of those will be Science Direct because they have so many other journals underneath Science Direct that people will want to publish under them. But you have to look at, first of all, are you an emerging researcher? And if you are, you might want to start small to increase your chances of being accepted. Because if you start in a journal that's high rated, obviously, like I review journals, but I'll probably say in terms of people that are well qualified to review journals, I'm probably a 5 out of a 10. There are individuals that have been doing this for 20 plus years, so they have a lot of knowledge and they've seen what could help an individual get accepted. So what they would do is they would send you a pre-feedback to refine your paper and then resubmit to be accepted. So I don't do any of those things because I like the individual to submit it and have those parameters already in there because it's your paper, you should do that. So you want to start small, look at something local, and then, if you start getting your papers accepted, you know that you actually have good ideas and you can start looking at higher journals. And then choose a journal related to your research, not just because you want to publish. If you're in the Department of Medicine, specifically, let's say pulmonology, you want to look at journals that look at pulmonology, or if you're in the Department of Neurobiology, you want to look at neurobiology journals. So I think that usually increases your chances because we want to read about topics that are going to help the journal. Like not only that, like if your paper is quality but it doesn't fit into the journal, you will not be accepted. And then you can look at multiple journals just to increase your chances. But the one caveat with this is you always have to, tailor to every journal. Because as I mentioned earlier, every journal has its own rules. You will find a journal, for example, I'm helping this individual tailor journals that they had initially submitted to or tailor their paper to these journals. They had originally submitted to a journal in India, and their rules are very, very flexible. Like they didn't have length restrictions, they didn't have table restrictions, and so they were able to publish in that journal because the paper was indeed great. But when they were about to submit this to a US journal, they had so many limitations. For example, only a couple of authors would be accepted. So if an individual did not fall into a criteria that they defined for who should be authored, they needed to be removed. The title had to be certain characters long. The abstract had to be 250. They had originally had this abstract at 500, so they had to cut 250 off. The whole paper had to be like 6 pages, and they only had to have like 10 references. So then it starts becoming like too much for a researcher, because when you put everything together, it's understandable, and when you have to cut out things that you find important, it becomes extremely difficult. So when you start to think about publishing to multiple journals, I would say read their rules first or their guidelines first. And for example, for your primary journal, you should start putting together that draft already, tailoring it to the journal, so that you don't have so much work to do afterwards. You're already looking at the rules and following them. And then familiarize yourself. Deadlines, there's nothing that can be done with it. I have received many, publications on manuscripts that have, violated the deadlines, and even though they were great, you have to throw them away because deadlines are deadlines. And you have to think about budget associated with publishing. Some journals are free, some are not. Some journals you have to pay to get your paper published. And it's awful because there are emerging researchers that are really great who may not have the budget to publish and pay for. And that's why I went back to say, like, choose an appropriate journal. So if your pockets are empty, you should be thinking about a journal that will accept you for free, at least to start with, and then you can look at journals that ask you to pay to publish. And then you have to, again, look at the restrictions. And then always stay active in research. So this is a great one because you want to have, does anybody here have a PubMed and CBI profile or publishing profile? And when someone looks you up, what pops up in those queries is your research that you've published, but it also lists the dates that you've published. And it rubs people the wrong way when I see that you published a paper in 2002 and your next one was 2020. Like, what happened within that length of time in between? So you want to stay active, and even if you're not publishing, you should comment. So comments are something that we look at when we review people's manuscripts. We want to see that you're contributing to journals or contributing to questions that people have about journals. It doesn't have to be that you're providing an answer to something, and I think that's what deters most people. Sometimes people would just post a question about a certain paper and ask if anybody knows what was happening with this. You can also say, well, I noticed this and I noticed this. It doesn't mean you have to answer their question, but as long as you're staying active and commenting on things and having a researcher profile, that's the other thing. We do look up researchers when we review your papers. I think most people don't think that, but we don't want to just recommend you to your manuscript to be accepted solely based on the paper you're providing. For example, if it's your very first paper, I think most people will be hesitant to recommend you because it is your very first paper. And I think I'll talk about it right here, which is why we also encourage that you collaborate with people, because there are individuals that are emerging researchers or even undergrads, right? Like they haven't published before, but we see that they have a PI that's published multiple times. So we knew that they had some type of supervision, and they had a different pair of eyes looking through them. So if you're a single author on a paper and it's your first time publishing, I would say probably 90% of the time you might get rejected, because a single author just says that you did this on your own. There isn't a lot of diversity and expertise in the paper. We're unsure that you actually have all of the skill set to write an entire paper by yourself with all the knowledge required. So I think one of the things that's extremely hard is that there are people that are driven to write papers, but maybe they can never find another individual driven enough. Maybe the individual doesn't get back to you, or they're slow, so people have a tendency to want to just write their paper on their own. But I would definitely say consult with a biostatistician, consult with someone other than another researcher if you just want to have diversity in your paper and have it represented. Any questions thus far? And of course, if you're doing a qualitative write-up or review, which is just writing, obviously you don't need a biostatistician. It might just be that you're trying to critique something in research, so you have to first look at what you're writing about and determine if you will need a biostatistician. If it involves stats, yes, you need a biostatistician. All right, and then remember that if an editor or a reviewer doubts something, they will ask you to defend, because this is usually before retractions. But this happens a lot more often than retractions. So, someone else, another researcher might critique your paper and say, why didn't you use this method? And so the editor will reach out to you and say, can you address your question? And so be prepared to say, well, we didn't use this method because maybe the design of our study did not allow us to compare it that way. Or maybe when we had conducted this study, this method was not in place at the time, but be prepared to answer, because those will usually come out, especially if your paper is a really good paper and everyone wants to adopt and use your methods. You will get a lot of questions because there's a lot of diversity with researcher resources. So sometimes people don't know how to replicate your research. So they will reach out to you and they'll say, instead of A, B, C, I have E, F, G. Can I replace it and use that instead? And so your knowledge of what you had done should be able to inform that and for you to be able to help them replace that. Or, all right, and always, this is really essential to your manuscript, that you include a power analysis that addresses your initial sample that you started with, so that, if a researcher wants to replicate your study, they have a basis to go off of. The suggested confidence intervals is usually, the suggested power is usually 95%. It is the gold standard. However, depending on if you have a restricted sample, you may use something a little bit more conservative, so 90% or even 85%. But if you're selecting a new sample and doing a power analysis, 95 and above is recommended. The confidence intervals to include usually also are 95% confidence intervals with 5% significance level, and always make sure to include this with any regression models. This is essential because we want to know what the range at which the value that you're using as your estimate lay in, and that really makes a lot more sense than just presenting the estimate by itself. So another issue is in manuscripts nowadays, you see individuals referring to p-values almost reaching significance. We want that to be very standard, so if you have a p-value less than 0.05, we would say it's significant. And if it's not less than 0.05, we would say it's not significant. It's a matter of eliminating that language that individuals would term approaching significance, which can put your manuscript in jeopardy of being accepted. So we want to make sure that we're not mentioning that. If you realize that you need to say something else, you can always reference other manuscripts that are similar to yours. And it's a good common practice to, after calculating your power analysis, if you do find out it's low powered, to state this as a limitation in your manuscript. And what this does is if you started out with a limited sample, there isn't really anything you can do about it. For example, let's say you're working in a rural area where you have a very limited number of samples to select for your outcome. You might just be able to use that for your study, but you might end up seeing that the power is low. And it's okay as long as you state this in your manuscript that you were likely underpowered. Also, any power that's seemingly underpowered is if you calculate it and it's under 70%. So if you consult with a biostatistician, we know that there's parameters that go into calculating that specific test that might work for you, that might not work for other type of data. But there are so many replicates that you usually don't know which one to use. So again, I would say yes, talk to someone who has knowledge of stats. And then make sure you address biases and you're missing data. I always see that a lot of times people just skip missing data and they don't say anything about it. And I know that's a pretty hard statistical method to use. So again, if you consult with a biostatistician, we would know what to do with that. And then for publication tables, I always say don't use the word formatted tables like this where you can pick a style, because I think this is just personal, but when people review a manuscript and they see all these tables that are just like directly from Word, it bores them because these have like so many colors and whatever that it becomes increasingly hard to know where to focus. What's much more acceptable is if you have a table like this that has been divided by lines. And I make these tables all the time. They're super easy to make, but it focuses my eyes on titles and actual numbers to look at. So I know that you've divided where your 95 confidence intervals are. I know where to look directly at. And I know the titles that you have. I know the legend you have at the bottom. It makes it easier for people to read and sparks their interest. You can also have something like this that's super easy and divided. Another question that I get a lot is when you published and you want to have color. This is weird, but you have to pay to have color. And people are just like, but it's what comes with my manuscript. Why do I have to pay extra? Well, the journal might not be printing in color. And if they're not printing in color, they don't want to print just your page in color and have to pay more for the press. So you will have to pay separately for your page to be printed in color. And it might be important because, for example, if you look at this figure that has lines, each of these lines represents something. If we were to take this and print it in black and white, we don't know what each line represents. So you might actually want to print in color, which means you might have to pay. And again, that goes back to what I was talking about in terms of choosing an appropriate journal. If there's money associated with it and I won't be able to pay for this, then I would move away from it because that isn't the whole point. The whole point is to publish research that you've worked so hard on. And then I put this on as another appropriate table to have. Again, that's also in color, but this one you can usually modify. So you can see that one of the lines have triangles and the other one have circles. So if you were to put this in a journal and they say we can't print this in color, that's fine. We just put a black color because the other one has triangles to represent. And then always give a next step in your manuscript. When you conclude and you have your limitations, you can say, we're going to use these limitations, or we're going to address these limitations in the next study that uses a larger sample. Maybe if you had a small sample, you can say that. You can also say stuff like, I want to look at a multi-site approach if your site was small. We usually recommend this for people publishing from rural areas that have very small samples. Again, that's all they have, but sometimes if their research is really good, they might want to consider a multi-site approach where they get organizations or individuals from other areas to collaborate and do the same research again. All right, so I'm just gonna put a takeaway in all of this together. My number one point is go to your biostatistician and spill your guts. Just say, this is what I wanna do. Can you help me figure out what would be acceptable? And if you usually wanna publish and you talk to me, the first thing I'll usually require is that you tell me what journal you wanna publish in and if you have their guidelines, because that's usually the driving factor. If you violate any rules they have, they will usually reject you solely based on that because they get so many manuscripts that that's the way that they filter them. You also still need to have knowledge of your statistics. So even though someone is going to help you and write them for you, don't just say it's someone wrote them for me. And I've heard this from multiple people asking when someone asks them a question like, so how did you, develop these percentage values? Oh, we just have a statistician that did it for us. That's great, but you still need to know what went into calculating that value and what it means. Don't just say like someone else did it for me, because it undermines your whole image of being that researcher who knows their research, and you don't want that to happen. And then again, be prepared to respond to article feedback and critique, specifically with the statistics. If they question it and someone else helped you, you can always go back. So if I'm the individual that helped you, you can come back to me and say, well, we got this critique, can you help me address this? Or someone wants to know how they can substitute this, are you able to help me respond to them? And I should be able to help you with that. All right, so if you have any questions whatsoever, we're open now to just ask any questions. Has anybody here ever wanted to publish or have individuals you work with publishing? And usually, what do? They just write up and publish, or are you involved in any way?
Not involved, I didn't see them do it.
Not involved? Okay.
I've helped and co-written some manuscripts.
Okay. Pretty cool.
Uploading, payment,
Okay.
sometimes reformatting images.
Yep. and that always takes a lot of time, because sometimes in the journals what they do is they might not even allow you to submit your paper in one. Some of them ask you to split the text from the images. So if you don't start doing that with the journal guidelines, then you have to go and copy and paste all your images elsewhere. And it's actually extremely difficult than it sounds, because the image that I showed you that was an actual publication table, it's all lines in Word. Like you actually have to draw the lines. So when you copy the text, all the lines just run away all over the page, and you may have to actually redo it all over again. So it's really great to start looking at those guidelines before. So yeah, when you go to the finish line and you realize you have to reformat all the tables, or maybe we don't accept tables that are longer than this length, so you have to shrink them.
Yeah, images, like confocal microscopy images.
Oh yes.
They're usually really big.
Yep.
You have to shrinking it.
Yep.
Then you are losing your resolution.
Yep. Yeah, so that's another thing that I help individuals with. So actually, I didn't know this, but the university has Photoshop and Illustrator, which you can actually put images in and reduce the DPI and the sizes. But people find it weird. They're like, why do I have to shrink my image? Well, they have the same standard paper format that they put your text and your tables in. And if someone has to sit there and redo it and put it in your paper, they're not going to be happy. So even when you're uploading things, I think most journals now have a pre-built-in image screener. It would tell you if your image is too big or if your DPI is bad, and then you won't be able to submit until you fix it. So that's where most people run into issues when they're ready to submit. Any other questions?
What do you do, I guess, for significance? I've always, like, they've talked about marginal significance, but I find that very, like, would you use that, or would you ever, I mean, because I never know where they want to cut that off.
Yeah. I think significance largely depends on your data, right? Like if you have specified in the very beginning, and I always use 0.05 because it's the gold standard, but not everyone uses it. You know, other people will use the 10% because they know their data is it's not that precise to be going with 0.05. So I think, you know, depending on your data, yes, you can use marginal. And if you decide 15% is a little stretching it, so 5 and 10 are like the gold standard, and usually we do check those because everything else is dependent on the significance, and we want to know what you've chosen to begin with. If you chose a 0.05 in the beginning, what's usually happening is we ignore that value then to begin with because we know it's the gold standard. If you've selected a 10%, we want to know, oh, well, they selected a 10%, something must be wrong. So a little bit more scrutiny on looking at your paper. So it just depends on your data, but yeah. Any other questions? No? Are you sure? Well, again, you know where to find me. You can always send me a request from the DOM website and just say, also with the tables, if you ever need help, you work with another researcher and you do the submissions. Is that your role? Okay.
I do what I'm told.
Okay. So if you're ever struggling with that, or you're like, oh, I don't know what to do with this table, I can definitely help reformat as well. I have lots of tables built that I can help you, and I always do this, and people are just like, why do you do that? Like I have tables that are the same in many different sizes because of the journals that I've seen and how they're crazy, you know? Like the font of the text is actually what you're changing most of the time. Some will accept it with a small font, some it has to be a certain font, and depending on what they're accepting, we might be able to use one of the tables of a different size that I have made. So you can always let me know if you need help with that. Any other questions? Okay, well, feel free to eat more cookies or continue on with the rest of your day, and don't go outside because it's still going to be raining. Thank you for coming. Yeah.